Okay, let's do this as fast as we can. Assyria is here, and the Assyrians are the people who live here. They're named after the city of Ashur, named after the god Ashur, ruled by the king of Ashur, the city, who is also associated with Ashur the god, which is both the god and the city, and the name of the people. For a while, everything was going swimmingly. The Assyrians as a people went through ups and downs in their already long history, but in the late 2nd millennium, everything was looking up. Then the Bronze Age collapse happened, and everything went to shit for everyone living in this area. The Assyrians had a hard time for about 200 years there, losing their little empire and having to fight barbarous mountain people for a while, but at least they weren't totally wiped off the map like the Mycenaeans and the Hittites. Then, in the 10th century, a new king of Assyria called Ashurdan came along. We don't know loads about him, because, he lived like 3,000 years ago, but it seems like he looked at the world around him and thought, well, we used to own all of this, and now we don't, and that sucks. So it's the duty of me, the king, to get back what is rightfully ours. So begins the great Assyrian Reconquista. Fine idea there, Dan. Can you back it up? Well, it turns out, yes, he could. He invaded the nearby Kadmuhu, captured its king, peeled off his skin, decorated his house with it, and placed a loyal subordinate on the throne. This lays the groundwork for what Assyria will be up to for the following centuries. But the next big question is, will this continue after he dies? Well, a couple of Syrian cities didn't reckon his son was up to much, so when Ashurdan died and Adad-nirari II took the throne, they stopped paying tribute. This turned out to be a mistake. Adad-nirari was just as capable and brutal as his father, and he expands Assyria even further and starts deporting his enemies to the Assyrian heartland. This is going to be a little bit of a theme going through Assyrian history. Got a rebellious population agitating for independence? Just pick them up and move them somewhere else. They can be used as a workforce to help with big building projects or do agriculture, and alone in foreign territory, it's pretty hard for them to organize rebellion, and it's much easier to keep an eye on them. And the only downside is an untold cost in human suffering, which, as we will see, hardly bothered the Assyrians too much. Of course, not all of these successes can be attributed to Adad-nirari alone. This was an era of increasing prosperity generally, as the Phoenicians and Aramaeans began expanding trade routes to a level that hadn't existed since before the Bronze Age collapse, bringing more wealth to the area generally. When he dies, he leaves the throne to his son, Tukulti-Ninurta, and he keeps conquering and making vassals out of his enemies, another Assyrian tactic at the time. This let local leaders maintain power, whilst also forcing them to do what the Assyrian King of Kings says. He doesn't reign very long, however, but his successor, Ashurnasirpal, is Assyria's first supercharged mega king. One of the main reasons that he's remembered as Assyria's super great king is because he told everyone just how great he was. In case you didn't hear what an absolute 10 out of 10 monarch Ashurnasirpal is, he literally had his accomplishments carved into the walls of his new mega palace at his new mega capital, the city of Kalhu. But don't get me wrong, Ashur is still the spiritual capital of Assyria, but business is now done in the palace at Kalhu. Once construction is finished, the king declares that the palace should never be modified, never neglected, never abandoned, and that no future king should ever move to a new palace in a new city. By the way, nobody listens to him. Like, all of his notable successors will move out and build their own palaces in their own cities. His palace still needed decorations, however, and what better than some thrilling hunt scenes? And the occasional dismembered body parts. He then campaigned west into Syria to collect heads and human skin for his interior decor, and whilst there he adds new land to the empire and becomes the first Assyrian king to reach the Mediterranean. Then when he gets home, he feeds everyone in a great big feast in his new capital, and then, satisfied that he's left a big enough palace to attract the attention of European pillagers in nearly 3,000 years' time, Ashurnasirpal dies. Now, you'd think that that'd be a pretty hard act to follow, but Ashurnasirpal's successor is Shalmaneser III, and Shalmaneser doesn't have as much time for civil engineering projects as his predecessor did, although he still does a few. But mostly he's busy fighting the largest wars Assyria has yet fought, and against brand new rivals. Round 1 is against Hadadezer, the king of Damascus. Those of you familiar with the Bible might know him as on-again, off-again friend of the Israelites, Ben-Hadad. At this point, he and the Israelites are friends, along with 10 other peoples in a team effort called the 12 Kings Alliance. And they're basically just a bunch of Near Eastern rulers who are setting aside their differences to face off against the growing power of Assyria. And together, they actually stand a fighting chance. They supposedly command a huge combined force, which is huge. So, according to old mate Shalmaneser, he crushes the alliance at the Battle of Karkar with his considerably smaller force. But Assyrian kings aren't really in the habit of being honest about how military stuff goes, and judging by the numerous other campaigns and battles that the king is going to have to fight against these people, perhaps this initial victory wasn't quite as crushing as he says it was. Either way, he wins in the end and occupies a lot of this area here. He also fights the northern people of Urartu, who continue to be a bit of a nemesis of Assyria. At this point, you might have noticed that the Assyrian kings spend a great deal of their time at war, and yeah, that's pretty accurate. The kings of Assyria were expected to campaign every single year, when he would gather up the men of Assyria, spend several months abroad beating up his neighbours, gather loot to enrich the heartland of the empire and to please the god Ashur, and then get everyone home safe and sound in time for the harvest. And this is why it's odd that in the last years of Shalmaneser's life, the army was not led by the king, but by non-royal generals. Many historians take this as evidence that he was either sick or maybe too old, something that the Assyrians would have done their best to hide. They were as superstitious as any ancient peoples. Illness was a sign of losing the god's favour, which was directly tied to his legitimacy to rule. And then when he finally does die, his successor, Shamshi-Adad, is immediately beset by a huge rebellion, led by his own brother. And it's possible that this civil war between the princes started before their dad had even kicked the bucket. Ashurbanipal, the rebellious brother, seeks an alliance with the other traditional Mesopotamian power in the region, Babylon. And in 814, Shamshi-Adad marches south into Babylonian territory and crushes his brother's allies. Now this may sound like good news, but the civil war had really done a number on royal prestige. The governors and client kings who were ruling on behalf of Assyria began acting more and more independently. Instead of simply representing the great king, they started to behave like they owned the place. Sure, they paid lip service to the royal palace, of course they did, but the central power of Shamshi-Adad is being slowly eroded as Assyria enters a time referred to as the Age of Magnates. This didn't really bother Shamshi-Adad, however, because pretty soon he was dead. The new king, Adad-nirari III, was only a child, which further eroded the power of the king, who was too busy being a literal infant to lead military campaigns or hunt lions. The main dude in the palace at this point seems not to have been a dude at all, but the king's mother, Shemuramat. Her actual position is unknown and debated, and no one can quite agree on how much power she really had, but probably quite a bit. More than her son at least, who was probably only just getting used to chewing solid food and walking on two legs. The actual reign is fairly mysterious, as very little survives from this period. What we can tell, however, is that these local magnates are becoming more and more powerful. Vassal kings and neighbours are getting ballsier, and the great wealth of Assyria is not what it was a few decades ago. Adad-nirari dies and leaves the throne to Shalmaneser IV. As if you needed any more proof that people were now looking back wistfully to the past, this guy is literally named for his very cool predecessor. You know, the guy who was in charge the last time everything was going well. And he got off to a pretty great start. He campaigned against Urartu, which was getting very powerful at this point, so, you know, well done. However, our evidence from his reign does suggest that things were only getting worse for the royal dynasty. Local magnates are now issuing their own inscriptions, which they aren't supposed to be doing, but there's sod all that Shalmaneser can do to stop them. Bit by bit, the cracks in the empire widen, and the whole system seems to be becoming more and more fragmented. Shalmaneser dies mysteriously, which might be suspicious, or might just be because we know so little about him anyway, and Ashurdan takes over, and he has a very, very difficult reign. He spends a lot of time at home, which is never a good sign in Assyria. The king was supposed to go to war annually, remember, even when things weren't great. So when a king doesn't leave the heartland of the empire for years at a time, it's usually a sign that things are getting really, really bad. And for Ashurdan, they were. To start with, during his reign there was a solar eclipse, which the Assyrians always interpreted as a bad omen. Then too, serious outbreaks of plague ravaged his lands, followed by 5 years of putting down large-scale rebellions within the empire. He did manage to engage in some minor building projects, which I guess shows that he didn't spend the whole time putting out fires, but still. He died, probably from exhaustion, in 755, and gives the throne to his brother. Adad-nirari's reign is shrouded in mystery. What a shock. In 10 years, he campaigned only 3 times, which is a sign that things had gotten less tickety-boo than ever, and at least one of these campaigns may have ended in a defeat, as the Assyrian rival of Urartu seems to have celebrated a victory over them at this point. So yeah, not great. Okay, fellow history buffs. Those of you who have studied basically any empire know what's happening here. Military defeats, lack of wealth, a series of weak kings, and local areas losing respect for central authority. All of these signs point to an end for Assyria, and they had a good run, but as the vultures gather to pick at its corpse, maybe it's finally time for this great civilization to keel over and die. Nope. Tiglath-Pileser III comes to the throne in 747, probably having fought and killed his way there. And he has ideas. Ideas to not only restore Assyria's power, but to push it further. Let's start with the army. Beforehand, it was made up of Assyrian men, who were obliged to join their king in his fight every year. The trouble was, because of this thing called agriculture, they had to return home pretty regularly to harvest crops and such. And besides, who wants to support a king who makes them spend years away from their families fighting in dangerous wars? So Tiglath-Pileser gets rid of this system, and he brings loyal provincials into the army, which is still based around a core of Assyrians, but now it no longer takes basically half the population of the homeland away for months at a time. So there is now no longer a limit on how long campaigns can go on for. Being able to stay in the field all year round and being professional soldiers, the Assyrian army becomes utterly dominant over anything else that exists at the time. He takes that army and restores royal control over the empire. So remember those client kings and powerful nobles who ruled over the provinces beforehand? Well, they're gone. Don't ask where, they're just gone, okay? And in their place are royal eunuchs. You see, without any baby-making bits, they can't have kids, and therefore can't create royal dynasties of their own. But they still control very large areas of the empire, and there's a lot of potential for successful rebellion. So Tiglath-Pileser cuts the provinces up into even smaller administrative zones, which makes rebellions even less likely to happen, and easier to crush if they do. He then solidifies his status as a biblical villain by picking on the Israelites. He defeats them and forcefully moves a large part of the population back to Assyria, starting phase 1 of the Assyrian exile. The leaders weren't so lucky, and then, after 18 years of restoring Assyria to its former glory, and then some, Tiglath-Pileser dies. His son, Shalmaneser V, takes power, but he only rules for 5 years and spends basically his whole time at war in the west. His most famous achievement is sacking the city of Samaria. You guys know Samaria, it's where the Good Samaritan is from. That biblical story in which Jesus berates his racist followers for being surprised that somebody from there was a decent bloke. Anyways, he takes Samaria and permanently ends the biblical kingdom of Israel. He then takes 30,000 of its inhabitants, and like his father, marches them back to Assyria. That's a total of 10 Israelite tribes that he disperses, by the way. He then dies. Suspiciously. Okay, so not only does Shalmaneser die young, but he's also succeeded by a fellow called Sargon II, and Sargon has big usurper energy about him. To start with, he claims to be the son of Tiglath-Pileser, something that historians are somewhat skeptical about, and secondly, he doesn't exactly speak well of his supposed brother and predecessor, which suggests that maybe he's trying to justify a murder and a usurpation. And thirdly, the name. The name Sargon is just too good to not be used by someone who was desperate for legitimacy. It translates roughly to legitimate king, which, look mate, if you have to call yourself legitimate, that doesn't exactly suggest that people are just assuming that you are. The name also evokes the legendary Sargon of Akkad, who built the region's first great empire way back when. Sargon II's use of it perhaps tells us that he's trying to make himself look like, well, Sargon II. It doesn't work perfectly, however, and Babylon, Damascus, and most worryingly of all, a lot of actual Assyrians resist Sargon's rule initially. They do not want to acknowledge him, and he doesn't even have full control over his home territory. So what's he Sargonna do about it? But Sargon's a pretty nutty military commander, and he tells them all to Sargon these nuts and defeated them all. He then deports 6,000 ungrateful Assyrians to Syria, to have them rebuild all the stuff that had been broken by other rebels. He then turns to the kingdom of Urartu, which has declined a little bit recently. The bloody horse people have been causing them trouble, and they don't really have the energy to fight Assyria right now. This doesn't bother Sargon though, who races through their territory and sacks their cities. It's a pretty comprehensive defeat, and Urartu will never again really be powerful enough to stand up to Assyria. When he returns home, Sargon is pretty proud of himself. As a reward for all of his hard work, he decides to build a new capital city. Dur-Shurakin will be his new palace, unlike previous Assyrian cities, which were usually just extensions of a pre-existing settlement. This one was completely new, and the whole thing was totally impractical. Like, cool, but impractical. Sargon wanted the city to be symmetrical, so it was, but this meant that the city and its gates didn't actually line up with any pre-existing road network. But that wasn't Sargon's problem. That was the architect's problem. The king had other stuff to deal with, like that rebellious Babylon, which he did. Easily actually. He set himself up in Babylon and ruled there for 3 years, seemingly reluctant to go back to Assyria until his new city was done. And in 706, it was. And Sargon walked the halls of the grandest palace ever built in the country, and must have thought, this is great. I hope this lasts forever. What's that? A tiny province in Anatolia has just rebelled? Okay, fine, thought Sargon. Time to grab an army, deal with these insolent subjects. He's never been beaten before, after all, even fighting huge armies, so I doubt this will be anything to worry about. Back soon. Won't be long. So Sargon is killed in the battle, and his body is never recovered. So yeah, the death of Sargon shook everybody, especially his son Sennacherib, who succeeded him. His reign would be filled with superstition, and his inability to recover his father's body would haunt him, because in Mesopotamian mythology, the afterlife is not all that kind to people who die in battle and aren't given a proper burial. He would consult priests about everything, just to make sure that there was no risk of repeating whatever horrific insult had led to his father's death. He physically and symbolically distanced himself from Sargon as much as possible, abandoning the new capital and moving everything back to Nineveh. Assyria now had a king who was almost desperately pious and fearful of insulting the gods. Unfortunately, he slipped up instantly. Sennacherib took the title King of Babylon, which makes sense, right? Babylon's a part of the empire. Well, not really. Assyrian kings often assumed some of the titles associated with Babylonian kingship, but they rarely named themselves King of Babylon for 2 reasons. Firstly, the Babylonians were notoriously independently minded, and secondly, being King of Babylon came with numerous, time-consuming religious activities, and Sennacherib failed to carry any of these out. Specifically, when anyone is named King of Babylon, they have to literally grab the cult statue of Marduk by the hands, and then have power invested in them by the divine. Sennacherib did not do this, so the Babylonians rebelled against Sennacherib. Twice, actually. And the second, more serious rebellion involved the eastern kingdom of Elam. Anyway, Sennacherib destroys Babylon, which he was initially hesitant to do because Babylon was sacred and historically and religiously important and all that, but by this point it was clearly causing more trouble than it was worth. At home in Assyria, Sennacherib renovates Nineveh with his war booty, making it look all flash. He then names his son, Ashurbanipal, as his heir, which turned out to be an unpopular move. Sennacherib had 3 sons. The eldest had died in the First Babylonian Rebellion, and then he chose as his heir his 3rd son, even though the 2nd son was more popular. Outraged at this, the disinherited young man murdered his father in a temple. This sacrilege didn't really work out, however, as it turned many of his own supporters against him. So Esarhaddon came to the throne upon the murder of his father and quickly gathered together an army to force his brother out, which he did, and soon enough he was uncontested monarch. But this betrayal early in his reign would have 2 serious effects on how the rest of it would go. To start with, he distrusted his male relatives, so he gave increasingly more power to the female members of his family. Secondly, he would be racked with paranoia, along with other mental and physical illnesses, his whole life. His palace became the most secure place in the empire, the whole thing designed just to make getting near him as difficult as possible. He also regularly uses the substitute king method of protection. This is where the king symbolically abdicates in favor of another for about 100 days, if they thought anything bad would happen. That way, they would be protected if someone was, say, I don't know, out to murder the king. After 100 days, the substitute is killed regardless of what happens, and the actual king resumes office. It's kind of remarkable that we know how sickly he was as well, given that the Assyrians were not all that keen on advertising an unhealthy king. Nevertheless, he was very conscious of it. Constantly surrounded by doctors, he had visitors to his palace follow an old and no longer used tradition of approaching the king with their head down and veiled, on their hands and knees. That way it was pretty tricky to get a good look at him and suss out how unwell he actually was. Despite his conditions, he was a relatively energetic king at times. He rebuilt Babylon after his father had sacked it, and then turned his attention west. He even made headway into Egypt, and briefly occupied the north of the country. But as soon as he left, the Egyptians retook all of his gains. This defeat was shortly followed by the death of his wife, and his infant son. And this devastated Esarhaddon, who locked himself in his room for days on end without food. He wrote a heartbreaking letter to a member of his court following the death of his son, saying, "I am feeling very sad. How did we act that I have become so depressed for this little one of mine?" The response, which, bear in mind, comes from a time before antidepressants could be bought over the counter, reads, "Had it been curable, you would have given away half your kingdom to have it cured. But what can we do? O king, my lord, it is something that cannot be done." Which is a nice reminder that even though the Assyrian kings made themselves out to be more like gods than humans, they were just like the rest of us. Anyways, he invades Egypt and dies. His son, Ashurbanipal, takes over the throne of Assyria, but only Assyria. Babylon is left to Ashurbanipal's brother, Shamash-shum-ukin, because, dividing a powerful empire up between heirs always works. Nobody knows exactly what the power-sharing agreement was at the beginning, but we do know that after a while it seems that Ashurbanipal seems to have pissed his brother off by making a big deal about being the senior monarch. Ruling over a people who hated Assyrian dominance anyway, and with an ally in the king of Elam, Shamash-shum-ukin rebelled. "Babylon shall be free," he cried approximately 3 months before Ashurbanipal crushed him and his forces, and he dies a cruel death. Some accounts even have him setting himself on fire in the middle of his palace like an ancient Denethor. Ashurbanipal then invades Elam, who is really not up to the fight. Their homeland is being invaded by these people called the Iranians, who we might know better as the Persians and the Medes, so when the Assyrians arrive, the Elamites are decisively beaten. Ashurbanipal tells us of a relatively complete victory. The Elamites don't totally disappear as a people, but this is basically the end for them as a major political player. It won't be long before the Persians totally supplant them. He then marches into Egypt to put a puppet on the throne, and then back to Egypt when the southerners rebel against his puppet. This solidifies the Assyrian conquest of the country, which was a successful, if devastating and costly venture, which led to 3 sackings of the ancient city of Thebes in only 1 decade. Ashurbanipal was a remarkable king not only for his conquests and the wars he won, but for his country and court. One of the reasons that we know so much about him is due to his huge building and art projects. Look, here's him hunting a lion. And here's him having brunch under some vines. Oh, look over there, a disembodied head. A great example of Ashurbanipal's intense love of art comes from how he named his years. So years in Assyria are often named after whoever was chief military official at the time. But the year 639 was named after Ashurbanipal's chief court musician. But do you know what he loved even more than art and architecture? Knowledge. Ashurbanipal's library was the first of its kind that we know about, a collection of 30,000 clay tablets. They talked about everything from science to religion to works of epic poetry, and it's largely thanks to this library that we have so much written information about the ancient Mesopotamians. The king himself seems to have considered this his greatest achievement, which is nice because Assyrian kings have a not undeserved reputation as cruel warmongers. But there's more to Assyria than that. There's the rich religious life and the poetry and the art and their reverence of and connection to the natural world around them. It's honestly quite beautiful once you look past all of the body parts and the torture scenes. I say this because they're about to lose all of it. Despite being one of Assyria's most well-attested kings, we don't actually know what happened to Ashurbanipal, or really that much about his immediate successor. The next major event in Assyrian history that we know of is the rise of Sin-Sharishkun, and the 2 rebellions he had to deal with upon taking the throne. The first was a revolt of the Assyrian generals and military men, and this was quickly followed by Babylon declaring independence again, this time under a new king called Nabopolassar. That's fine though. Babylon, as we know, has rebelled many times, and Assyria always crushes them. Except this time, even without their Elamite allies, the Babylonians win. It seems like the rebellion and civil war of the generals might have done a little bit of a number on Assyria's military, and for some reason they just cannot drive the Babylonians south. Instead, they just had to deal with this new rival power sitting on the doorstep of their heartland. But for now, things are in a stalemate. Sin-Sharishkun cannot reconquer Babylon, and Nabopolassar doesn't have the strength to push his conquests any further. But as the years go on, Babylon's power increases as the locals become more and more confident that the Assyrians won't return, while the Assyrian king grows only weaker. Then, a third power came into the mix. The Medes descended into Assyrian territory, defeating their armies and sacking the religious capital of Ashur. Now this was a really big deal. Ashur had been safe for centuries, and it was where all the new kings were crowned, but it was nothing compared to what was about to happen. The Median king Cyaxares met with the Babylonian Nabopolassar and created an anti-Assyrian alliance, sealed with the marriage of Nebuchadnezzar, the prince of Babylon, to a Median princess. Then, the combined armies of Medes and Babylonians marched on Nineveh. After 3 months of siege, the capital of Assyria fell and was razed to the ground. Shin-Sharish-Kun dies in the siege, and the Assyrian Empire dies with him. Kind of. His brother dicks around in Haran for a little while, claiming to be successor to the throne, but that doesn't last very long. And like that, Assyria fades away, undoubtedly one of the most fiery and destructive ends to a civilization in history, appropriate for such a destructive empire, the great achievements of which were buried by sand, only to be unburied in the 19th century and put in museums for us to gawk at. And that's just that. Bye.